In July of 1518, a woman named Frau Trophäa walked out of her half-timbered house in Strasbourg, stepped into the middle of a narrow cobblestone street, and started dancing. No music, no festival, no audience, just a woman alone, spinning and jerking and flailing her arms in total silence. Her husband ran out and begged her to stop. She didn't. He grabbed her arms. She twisted free and kept going. By sunset, she was still dancing. By midnight, she was still dancing. When the sun came up the next morning, Frau Trophäa was still in the street, feet swollen and raw, dancing before she'd had a single drop of water. This went on for somewhere between 4 and 6 days straight. No food, no rest. Just continuous, involuntary, full-body convulsive dancing until she finally collapsed in a twitching heap on the ground. And then it spread. Within a week, 34 people had joined her, not on the same street, across the entire city, complete strangers who had nothing in common with Frau Trophäa, who had never spoken to her, who simply watched what was happening and found that their own bodies would not stop doing the same thing. By the end of July, somewhere between 50 and 400 people were dancing uncontrollably through the streets of Strasbourg. The historical records genuinely cannot agree on the number, which tells you exactly how chaotic things had gotten. The Imland Family Chronicle says 400. Other sources say fewer. Every single source agrees it was not a small problem. These were not performers. They were not celebrating anything. Chroniclers who stood and watched described their faces as blank and slack, their eyes glassy and distant, their clothes soaked through with sweat. Some had torn their own shoes off. Others had feet so swollen the leather had split open, blood seeping through the gaps. They had been dancing for days, without food, without water, without sleep. They could not stop. They literally could not make their own legs stop moving. Now, Strasbourg in 1518 was technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, which meant it had a city council, and that city council suddenly had to figure out what to do about several hundred citizens convulsing in the public streets. So they called in the physicians. The physicians of 16th century Strasbourg worked with humoral theory, the dominant medical framework of the era, which held that all disease was caused by imbalances in the body's 4 vital fluids. They examined the dancers, they consulted their texts, and they arrived at a diagnosis. The dancers were suffering from overheated blood. The hot blood had risen to their brains and was causing the involuntary movement. The only cure was to let the fever run its course, let the heat burn itself out through physical exertion. The official medical prescription for the dancing plague of 1518 was more dancing. The city council followed the doctor's orders to the letter. They ordered carpenters to build a large wooden stage in the horse market. They built another in the grain market. They hired professional musicians, drummers, fiddlers, pipers. They recruited strong, healthy volunteers to dance alongside the afflicted to keep their energy up. They converted 2 guild halls into temporary dance floors with wooden stages and hired even more musicians to play around the clock. The idea was simple: create the perfect environment for the dancing to exhaust itself naturally. It did not exhaust itself naturally. Here is what the physicians and the city council failed to account for. The vast majority of people in 16th century Strasbourg already had a very specific explanation for what was happening. They believed the dancing was a curse sent by Saint Vitus, a 3rd century Christian martyr who supposedly punished sinners by forcing their bodies to dance until they dropped dead. So, when the citizens of Strasbourg looked out their windows and saw the government building stages, hiring bands, and actively encouraging people to dance harder, they did not see a medical treatment being administered. They saw proof that the curse of St. Vitus was real. They saw the city surrendering to it. More people joined the dancing. The numbers climbed, and then the dying started. Strokes, heart attacks, sheer physical exhaustion. At the peak of the epidemic, chroniclers recorded 15 deaths per single day. 15 people dead because they could not stop their own legs from moving. The council realized their mistake and reversed course completely. They tore down the stages. They banned all public music in the city, all public dancing. They made one exception for weddings, and even then, only stringed instruments were permitted. Absolutely no drums. Drums, they had concluded, were the dangerous part. But the damage was done. People were still dancing. People were still dying. And the city council of Strasbourg was entirely out of ideas. Except for one. When Frau Trophäa had finally collapsed after nearly a week of continuous dancing, the authorities had loaded her into a wagon and carted her 30 miles south to the town of Saverne. On a hilltop above the town sat a shrine dedicated to St. Vitus himself, the same saint the entire city believed had started the plague in the first place. And at the shrine, somehow, Frau Trophäa had stopped dancing. So the council did the only thing left to try. They loaded the worst cases into wagons, still thrashing, still twitching, still jerking their limbs against the wooden rails, and they sent them bouncing down 30 miles of unpaved medieval road to Saverne. The journey took 3 days each way, 3 days in a cart with no suspension, while your body refused to hold still. At the shrine, priests performed a ritual. They carried the dancers, some of whom were described as flopping around like landed fish underneath a carved wooden figure of St. Vitus. They pressed small wooden crosses into their hands. They placed red shoes on their bleeding, swollen feet. They sprinkled the shoes with holy water and painted crosses on the soles with consecrated oil. The chapel was thick with incense smoke. Latin chanting echoed off stone walls. And the dancers stopped. One by one, the twitching slowed and the legs went still. The glassy eyes blinked and cleared nakund. They stood up, looked around, and stopped. Word reached Strasbourg. More wagons were sent. Within a week, the stream of convulsing pilgrims had slowed to a trickle. By early September of 1518, roughly 2 months after Frau Trophäa first stepped into that street, the dancing plague was over. The explanation that held for centuries was ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye. Contaminated bread can cause hallucinations and violent convulsions. The physician Paracelsus visited Strasbourg 8 years later and pointed the finger at exactly this. The problem is that ergot restricts blood flow to the extremities. Your limbs go numb and seize up. A person suffering from ergot poisoning physically cannot dance for days on end. The historian John Waller, who spent years researching the plague, ruled it out completely. What Waller and most modern researchers settled on is something called mass psychogenic illness. And the context changes everything. In the decade before 1518, the people of Strasbourg had been through absolute devastation. Famine, smallpox, syphilis arriving in the region for the first time, harvests failing year after year, winter so cold the Rhine froze solid. The entire population was already in a state of severe psychological distress before Frau Trophäa ever took a single step. And dancing manias were not new to the Rhine Valley. At least 10 separate outbreaks had been recorded along the Rhine since 1374. The people of Strasbourg did not merely suspect that St. Vitus could curse you with uncontrollable dancing. They knew it happened. Their grandparents had told them the stories. The belief was as solid and real as the cobblestones under their feet. So when Frau Trophäa began convulsing in that street The entire city was primed, stressed to the breaking point, steeped in a cultural belief that told them this exact thing was not only possible, but inevitable. Their brains, under enough sustained pressure, did what brains under pressure have done across every culture and every century in recorded history. They followed her into it. The same mechanism behind the laughing epidemic that swept through Tanzania in 1962, when a fit of giggles in a boarding school spread until entire villages were affected. The same mechanism behind trance states during religious ceremonies in Brazil, Madagascar, and Kenya today. The conscious mind steps aside. Pain stops registering. Exhaustion vanishes. The body surrenders to the pattern, and the pattern takes over. 400 people in Strasbourg did not dance because of a fungus or a saint. They danced because they believed with absolute certainty that they had been cursed, and their brains made it real. The red shoes worked for the same reason the dancing started, because they believed the red shoes would work. Frau Trophäa started dancing in July. By September, the streets were quiet. The stages had been torn down and burned for firewood. The musicians had gone home. The city kept the drum band at weddings on the books for years afterward, just in case. Somewhere in Strasbourg, a woman with ruined feet sat in her house, finally still, with no memory of the previous 2 months of her life.